This show is strictly for educational purposes. The opinions expressed on the show are personal to the individuals appearing in the show and not those of Thinking Tree Ecoholics Private Limited. The show is not intended to offend or defame any individual, entity, caste, community, race, or religion, or to denigrate any institution, person, living or dead. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Hello and welcome to Ecoholics Thinking Tree series. Today we have with us Dr. Abhishek Saurav, and he is the economist at the World Bank. So that is quite sufficient. And apart from this, he is currently doing a research on the global pandemic and its effect on business. So the same topic that we'll discuss today, because he is also a very important personality, especially in the policy making and the research. So hello and welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much, Sanath. Very glad to be connected.
Yes. There has been much discussion and debate about this pandemic, COVID-19, yet the audience feels that no viable solution is in the sight to come out of it. In today's discussion, we will talk about small and medium businesses because they are the ones who are most severely impacted from this pandemic. The larger businesses, owing to their deep pockets, can keep themselves afloat for a much longer time. So in today's discussion, we will go through the basic business models followed in India and around the world. And we are like preemptive measures what we can take or could have been taken to reduce the COVID and what is the way ahead from here. So to begin with, sir, epidemic are both a standalone business risk and an amplifier of existing trends and vulnerability. How do you see this situation?
That's right, Sanath. So, in addition to the serious nature of the COVID-19 pandemic and the health risks associated with it, we know that there are several economic implications that we have to deal with in the wake of the pandemic. So, in terms of a standalone business risk, COVID-19 began as a shock to production in the Chinese economy. Um, and because of the interconnected nature of global production, trade, and the global economy, we have seen that a successive series of demand and supply shocks have manifested, have been unleashed on the global economy. Um, let's take a moment to think about some of these supply and demand shocks that Indian businesses, along with many other economies, are now exposed to. On the supply side, we see that um, because of the nature of the infection, worker productivity and the availability of labor has been severely constrained in the short run. That means that production cannot go on as normal. In fact, the very nature of collective production, that is manufacturing in high density settings, is not plausible as long as the virus is amongst us. On the other hand, the second effect, and I think more important one, has been because of the supply chain linkages with China and the global nature of supply chains. Um, Businesses in India and elsewhere rely on raw inputs, intermediate goods, and final goods from supply chains. And with the global disruption on supply chains, we have seen that the business risk has been magnified. Whatever goods Indian businesses would like to produce, at some point or the other, these shortages are expected to manifest in their production cycles. On the demand side, the story is quite different, and you must have heard a lot of people characterizing this problem as a demand problem, right?
Yes.
So just like I gave you the example of the collective production limitations, there's also limitations on collective consumption. So there's a typology of effect. We know that certain services firms have been more forcibly hit. And the reason for that is the very nature of consumption in services involves associating with individuals. It's in a collective setup. And hence, consumer demand has suffered because of that limitation,
Yes.
practical limitation. In addition to that, there's also a loss of consumer, there's a shift in consumer preference and a loss of consumer demand because of government measures related to restrictions and lockdowns, which are clearly needed across the world. So we've seen a dip in consumer demand. So this is what has happened because of the pandemic.
Yes.
But let us also try and appreciate what was happening in the world before COVID. So we were amidst one of the highest levels of uncertainty, business uncertainty, because of trade and policy, trade and investment policy tensions. We were seeing increase in restrictions across the globe. This applies to mostly foreign companies, but that was a clear uptrend in that sense. There was flagging global growth. As you know, predictions for global growth were already quite modest, and the pandemic has now forced the world into a global recession. So in that way, it is a magnifier of what was the story that was already being scripted, and it has taken the decline to a completely new level. And just to put this in context, I think recent estimates from the IMF show that global growth is projected at negative 3%.
Yes.
In comparison to estimates as recently as December 2019 or January 2020, this is a significant downward revision, which has happened in a period of one quarter, that is 3 months. And I think it's a serious situation.
Yeah, indeed, because the global supply chains also affected. And if we talk about a particular country, like emerging countries like India, they are also struggling with that. So it's like demand and supply both, obviously, the part of scissors, we can say, as Marshall suggested. So we cannot say that this is a demand side or a supply side. So they come both at the same time.
Right, and that's the very nature of this pandemic, which makes it quite severe. That the sources of disruption emanate both on the supply side and demand side, which then means that policy should as much attend to supply as much to consumer demand. And there are many prescriptions about this, and there are many things we know, and I believe we can touch upon some of those in the remaining part of the session.
I think moving on to, like, there are many solutions possible when we talk about the organized sector. However, our unorganized sector, like India, neither has a capital nor has the infrastructure to keep afloat for a particularly long time. Like barbers, street cart owners, small shops, non-essential small services. These people do not come under the BPL category, below poverty line. Hence, they are also not eligible for direct benefit transfers from the government side. And there are fair chances that they would run out of their savings in couple of months, or maybe 3 months, 4 months without work. With the stigma that comes along with COVID, people will be apprehensive in using the services of these unorganized sector workers for a long time. What can be done to sustain them through this pandemic?
Very good question, Sanat. I think this question is on policymakers' mind quite prominently, and I think both the media and policy circles are attending to this question. So let's look at it this way. So this vulnerability, I think, is quite pronounced, and just to get a grasp of the problem, we know that globally, and I'll come to some statistics for India, but globally, from about 2 billion workers who are employed in the informal sector, the unorganized sector, it is estimated that in excess of 1.5 billion of them are facing risk of loss of income and livelihood. So the problem is quite big globally. And I think the problem is of similar magnitude in India as well. We know that more than 80% of workers in India are, I think the estimates are closer to 85%.
Yes.
Are in the unorganized sector.
Yes.
And naturally, because the unorganized sector does not have access to formal ways of credit, access to government services, which I think in the time of pandemic is even more important, they are unable to be protected by the safety nets that may be provided for during a pandemic. So that's the nature of the problem and the magnitude of the problem. Let us try and unpack the vulnerabilities, right? So the unorganized sector is characterized by MSMEs mostly.
Yes, mostly.
Right? Mostly. And they have a few workers. Sometimes they are just one or two people who are providing a certain type of service. This also means that except the wage bill, that satisfying a wage bill, there's not much cash reserve in those systems, in those businesses. And in times of a pandemic, the vulnerabilities become apparent because there is no fallback. And without a support, without some means of support from the government, the issues are quite serious. But there are certain possibilities to have, right? And before we get to the possibilities, let me offer a perspective on this, how important this issue is. So informal businesses, the choice that they are faced with is quite contrasting. On one hand, there is livelihood, which they gain from their from MSME operations, and on the other hand, it is safety. So for any lockdown or movement restriction to be effective de facto, it is important that 80% of workers in India are incentivized to stay indoors or restrict their movement. And the only way to do that is to ensure a substitute for the livelihood, which even if they were out on the streets and selling their goods, is not assured because of declined consumer demand. But there are certain things that can be done, right? So the policy prescriptions on that. Similar to MSMEs in the formal sector, I think one-time grants conditional on formalization requirements would be an excellent policy suggestion to the extent that it can be carried out. It would have a double benefit. It would extend the safety net to the unorganized sector, at the same time, bring them into the fold of formal sectors so that they are observable to the system. That's one. The other thing is access to credit has been an issue, and I think that becomes a profound issue for MSMEs. The way access to credit works is you need credible borrowers, and credibility is signaled through certain documents, business operations, and continuity in the past.
Indeed.
So there are substitutes for that. For example, informals also work with suppliers, and they do have supplier invoices because that's a proof of business operations. So rather than waiting for them to formalize, those supplier invoices and legitimate proof of business operations could be leveraged to qualify them for credit. So I think these are some innovative ways of looking at this. But of course, the long-term goal becomes transitioning to the extent possible from informality to formality. And if you'll entertain me, there's some recent research which I've been participating in which we have explored the incentives for formalization. And what recent research uncovers is that it is all about the incentives to go underground. Informal businesses choose to go underground because of certain weaknesses in the legal and regulatory environment, because contract enforcement is not as effective. Legal recourse to business wrongdoing is not strong, and protection is not adequate, that they choose to go underground, that is informal. One-off reforms have limited utility. And I think what is required is an upgrade to the legal and regulatory system in which small businesses operate. And I think that will see, hopefully, based on evidence suggests, that should see an uptick in rates of formalization and hopefully survival in the long run.
Yes, that's perfect, sir, because that's a perfect suggestion for the policymakers, because at Thinking Tree, we are looking for a solution, and I appreciate that that's a perfect solution to formalize the unorganized sector. And that's a great move, great suggestion, sir. Talking about the retail shops like malls, cinemas, hospitality, they are badly hit in these times. From a health standpoint, is there a reasonable time frame when they can get back on their feet?
I think that's a tough one. It requires a certain ability to estimate the future course of things.
Yes.
Mm, so I've seen several estimates of recovery,
Yes.
resilience in recovery. And I think now the focus and consensus is emerging around, and I'm attending to the time question first,
Yes. Yes.
is 18 months or
18
beyond,
months or beyond.
which puts us at the end of 2021.
Okay.
What does this mean for services sectors? So you know that um, the services sectors has been at the front of all the declines, associated declines related to the pandemic. Their revenues are down to a greater magnitude. The loss of consumer base, clearly,
Yes.
margins have suffered. Liquidity problems have emerged,
Liquid.
which means that they cannot afford the wage bill. They cannot afford to pay salaries to their workers, formal, informal, and I think the problem is persistent across. We know that the formal sector has access to certain programs and schemes introduced by the Indian government
Yes.
and the states, but there's a big question on how fast the system could move.
Yes.
So. Um, so 18 months and beyond is what we are looking at, and that's a problematic time frame because a lot of the MSMEs most likely will not be able to weather the storm that long. And
Yes.
the question then becomes, what is the projection of such effect on small businesses, on the livelihoods of those individuals who engage with them, who work in them? So that's
Yes.
a big question. I think I'll leave that question for later.
Yes.
Um, but let us also understand why the services sector has been affected. I think I touched upon this earlier, that
Yes.
limitations on collective consumption, and I think these things are going to continue in the near term. They are going to continue most likely to the extent that consumers are comfortable to be around other individuals, and I think that depends both on the suppression strategies being used, that is, the distancing and isolating and contact tracing and others, and mitigation strategies that are emerging, and hopefully sooner than later, in terms of medical solutions and vaccinations that will manage the the harmful effects of the contagion when it gets to the people it does get to,
Yes.
that is after infection. So till the time consumers are comfortable to be back in surroundings adjacent to other individuals, I think that would be the time when we should expect businesses to start nearing a near normal, if not a pre-pandemic normal.
Yes, indeed, indeed. That's a perfect solution. We can think about like 18 months from now, that is from month of June, we can say, and tourism sector is also affected badly. So yeah, like moving on to other questions, like in your opinion, what are the long-term problems that are yet to arise as a result of COVID-19? Is there any way that we can brace ourselves for that?
When you say long term, of course, you're talking about the longer term economic outcomes rather than the short term
Yes.
health crisis. There's several that we can talk about. Let me begin by talking about slow growth. Um, I think the problem of slow growth is magnified for India in particular, South Asia in more general. As you know, in the pre-pandemic time, growth had already slowed down to approximately 5% year on year.
Yes, yes.
Um, and if I recollect well, from 8.3% in FY 2017, it was down to, I think, 5.1,
Yes, even
around that.
4.5. Yes.
Right. It has been revised down furthermore in FY20 and furthermore in FY21. Some estimates suggest that there's going to be a recovery beyond FY21, but that those estimates have high confidence intervals, which then means that there is a lot of room
Room
for variation
and
in what we will observe. So slow growth is a problem, and it is a problem because the last decade or so, and especially in the last 5 to 7 years, gains on poverty alleviation were quite marked in India.
Yes.
Um, the dividends of economic growth were finally being reaped by a wider majority of the population, which then means then that the issue of poverty, the sticky issue of poverty, was being addressed. That is, fewer people, however we define poverty, were below the poverty line, and I
Yeah.
think that there's enough statistics on that for to require more articulation. And I think that pace of change is at risk when we see slower economic growth now and in the future. So that's the first problem. The other problem is that the pandemic magnifies the vulnerabilities of our society. That is, and when I say society, it's the people who have less, people who are poor. And the reason for that is there are certain characteristics, um, or let us say access issues to people who live in poverty that make them more susceptible to the health risks of the pandemic. For example, concentrated household settings
Yes.
in which there is just per square meter there's a higher number of people, and that, as you know, because of the nature of the virus, that increases the risk of exposure. Some statistics also suggest that in India and elsewhere in South Asia, um, the reach of sanitation practices was also conditional on economic well-being, which means that sanitation practices which could prevent the spread of the virus may also be less practiced and common in some parts. So these are some of the problems of the poor. Let me also touch upon the issue, and I think it's a very timely and topical issue, of migrant laborers who we have seen an exodus from urban centers to rural areas. Um, so the migrant labor who work in urban India are, in one way to characterize them, is surplus labor, agricultural sector labor from
Yeah.
rural areas who have been able to find meaningful livelihoods and employment in urban areas. Now that they come back to their villages, the countryside, uh, and smaller towns where they hail from, um, the livelihood problem becomes even more magnified, because a significant portion of society, that is, who was previously working, whether formal or informal, has now become dependent on livelihood, because employment opportunities have been forcibly taken away from them because of the virus, the pandemic. So this magnifies the vulnerabilities of the poor. Uh, there's a third issue also that I see, um, and the issue is about human capital and skills.
Yes.
The issue related to human capital and skills is that the disruptions that we see in the economy, we also see similar disruptions in the education sector. And
Yes.
the youth of the country are disproportionately negatively affected by a disruption in human capital accumulation because of the the closure of schools and colleges and universities. The and how do, I do not know how long it will take to go back to a new normal or new ways of education, and
Yes.
I'm sure technology can pave a way for towards the solution and efficiency. Uh, However, the time that has already been lost, and the time that is being lost till we catch up to the technology frontier, I think
Yes.
represents a human capital loss and opportunity. And I think that's a third vulnerability whose whose effects we will be realizing in the future.
Yes. 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 Continuing with that, like whatever you said, for the poverty, for the migrant levels, what is the role of multilateral institutions that like supporting poor and vulnerable, supporting small businesses, economic recovery? How we can channelize the maximizing the benefits accruing to the people?
So I think it's a very broad question. There's no simple way to respond to that.
Yes.
But a policy response, like to the extent that policy response and advisory affect outcomes for the vulnerable, I think there's role for good policy research to understand the drivers of the vulnerability. For example, in the case of migrants, as I was earlier commenting, the issue is the loss of livelihood, which seems temporary,
Yes.
but has a longer term estimate
Yes.
projection. And the reason for that is till the new normal is attained, the migrant labor do not have sources of livelihood to go back to. And no one
Yes.
knows in
Indeed.
what is the time frame of the return of the migrants. They want to return, society wants them to return. It's good for production, it's good for productivity. Um, and we do not know a policy response that could quickly fix that problem. So I think understanding and unpacking the problem is really important. It's important to unpack the problem so that we can first identify the vulnerable and target them through livelihood support measures, which remains the primary concern during the pandemic. We need to ensure welfare. We need to ensure um, that the benefits reach the poor. Despite any leakages in the system and administrative inefficiencies and coordination problems and high transaction costs,
Yes.
despite all those problems, the agenda is to get the support to the vulnerable and the poor, which includes the migrant groups.
Yes. Yes. Indeed. Indeed. How do you think COVID has affected the ease of doing business in various countries? If we talk about especially India as well and the other
Right.
countries.
So I think your question is about the business environment, right?
Yeah,
Business
business.
environment challenges. Yeah.
Yes. That index that World Bank publishes. So there
Right.
are different criteria. Yeah.
So I wouldn't characterize the pandemic as bringing new challenges, although I'm sure there are a few new challenges, brand new complexities that have been exposed, that companies have been exposed to, businesses. But I think doing business in the old way has become more difficult because of the pandemic. Right?
Yes. Yes. Perfect.
Let me use a few examples to motivate this view. Let us look at credit information. So one of the important aspects of running a business is access to credit.
Yes.
Access to credit from financial institution works based on an architecture of credit information. So businesses' credit worthiness is known partially or completely to financial institutions, and that information is shared to some measure between financial institutions as a signal of
Yeah.
credit worthiness of businesses. So let us think about the problem of the pandemic. The pandemic has meant that revenues have depleted, margins have been lost, and liquidity is the fatal blow. With lack of liquidity, what is most likely to happen is that small business, particularly, but even it applies to larger businesses, are less likely to be able to pay dues to their creditors, which means it perversely affects their credit history, credit worthiness, and different signals. So imagine that this happens in the first few months of the pandemic as the first order effects on their businesses are realized. The second order effect that it causes is that in during a period of resilience and recovery, when the same businesses need to access more credit to rebuild their businesses,
Yes.
those that same credit information, which has now been in some cases reduced in its quality, is going to preclude them from accessing credit on good terms from a large number of creditors. So you see the
Yes.
problem. The old problem of access to credit has now been magnified because of the pandemic. It's not a new problem,
Yes.
but it is affecting businesses in a new manner. So
Yes.
that's an example. I can think of a few other examples related to know your client requirements, licensing,
Yes.
customs clearance, and logistics. There's so many examples. Let me use the example of logistics and customs clearance. So we know that supply chains have been disrupted,
Yes.
which then translates into backlogs at logistics hubs, ports, shipment centers.
Yes.
And the backlog is a problem because so we know that in India and developing countries, some strides are being made to improve clearance times. Time has always been an issue.
Yes. Yes.
And businesses do not like to wait for these clearances. What has happened because of the pandemic is that because of delays experienced at transportation and logistics hubs, the delays have been increased. That delays have increased. When delays increase, which means that emergency and much needed supplies that have, if they have come in, are now less accessible to businesses. So again, an old problem of delay is further magnified because of the pandemic. So I think these are some examples in which doing business has become particularly challenging in this time. There are several policy solutions to it. One of them would be regulatory reform of a magnitude and order not seen before.
Yes.
So I'll leave it
Yeah.
at that. Right.
Yeah. Rightly said, because turnaround time in India is already high if we talk about the ports, especially.
Correct.
So that's good. Moving towards the like India and the other countries, especially, is India equipped for making use of the opportunity afforded to us by walking out to various companies from China and they are looking for some other destination? So, what is your take on that? What kind of opportunities that India can take?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk on this topic, right? And I think
Yes.
that the issue is about global supply chains and the organization that the flux and the organization that may be revisited by global corporations. So again, let's begin by understanding the problem a little bit, not the problem, but the trend. So global production is characterized by mostly multinational companies producing throughout the world. Of course,
Yes.
concentrations differ throughout the world, mostly driven by considerations of cost. Offshoring has been driven by cost considerations.
Yes.
What this has meant over the years is that supply chains have become overly reliant on a few global players, that is, a few economies.
Yes.
And this is a source of risk. It's a diversification risk, or better to call it lack of diversification risk.
Yes.
And I think companies have very, very quickly realized because of the pandemic that this risk is quite serious and can bring their businesses to a halt. So business strategies and boardroom strategies must now be focusing on how to diversify the supply chain risk, how to revisit global value chains, that is, sources of production and how global production is organized. And while they think about these changes, I think is an opportunity area. This is an opportunity area. This is a time to reposition and maybe reconfirm the suitability of certain economies over others. And the answer is not straightforward. We have always known what attracts multinational companies.
Yes.
We know there's the role of skills and labor cost. We know there's a role of legal and regulatory environment. It's
And
highly important.
yes.
We don't want to see a restrictive regime. We also know that foreign companies like investor protection. They do not. They are averse to risk. So there are many things that we know from literature and practical experience that matter to foreign companies, to multinational companies.
Yes.
And I think multinational companies is fascinating, is important, right? Because I also work in this area more closely.
Yes.
More than 20% of global production is accounted for by multinational companies. In magnitude, that's quite high.
Yes.
And over 70% of global trade is accounted for by multinational companies. So you can see that the current era of globalization in some ways is anchored on the operations and production of multinational companies. So you talked about opportunities for other countries, including India. So I think there's clear opportunity. And I think this opportunity builds on appetite which existed for some time now. We have seen a successive momentum of reforms in India, opening up of sectors, removing restrictions, making doing business for foreign companies and domestic businesses simpler and faster. We have seen that momentum.
Yes.
But I think to be able to facilitate a rapid gain from the reorganization of supply chains, more thrust on the same areas is required. We need, again, as I mentioned earlier, systematic reform in this area as well. That is, removing sectoral constraints, um, removing some sectors that were not open, removing limits to investment in sectors, ex- uh, also expunging any limitations and restrictions related to product, um, technology use, um, give foreign companies an open business operational environment. And I think they're likely to choose that business environment over others.
Oh,
There's always a role of infrastructure. And I think some of the work that has happened in the area of improving facilities as special economic zones, both physical and governance facilities, I think they're important and more needs to be done. Because if you are to compete globally, one needs to have global plug and play infrastructure ready.
yes.
And I think these are the thrust areas which could very quickly um, interlace with the need for uh, large employment projects in India, because it serves two purposes. It generates employment in the shorter term, but at the
Yes.
same time um, enhances the value proposition of locating in India as supply chain and value chain decisions are being revised. So I think there's a great potential, and we can talk
Good.
about this.
Since like government of India has reduced the corporate income tax and doing like
Right.
a lot of things in the past to ease of doing business ranking, so that has been resulted in the improvement of ranking since last 4 or 5 years to 63. So it's like aiming to top 50. If I ask you like what are the most important thing that India can improve upon, if one single point,
So
yeah.
right. So it's clear. I'll rely on data evidence
Yeah.
to give you an insight. Um, our unit at the World Bank recently concluded a global study based on a survey of foreign investors, existing foreign investors in 10 middle income countries, which includes India, China, Vietnam, Turkey, Nigeria, others. And we find that in India, the three restrictions on top of investors' minds are obstacles in investment approvals, number one. Number two and number three, price restrictions, technology restrictions that are faced in by foreign firms, and limits to investment in sectors. So
Yes.
when
That can.
investment is capped, right? When investment is capped to a share or an absolute number, these things
Yes.
have come out from that direct survey evidence from India to matter the most for existing investors. Let me also add that this is across manufacturing and services. It is not just um, constraining a set of investors, but investors across the broad spectrum of sectors and industries.
Perfect, sir. Perfect. Indeed. And that's a beautiful solution that India can take. So I hope that the policymaker can listen to this and implement this. Talking about the small businesses, like what are the lessons from South Korea, Singapore that we can implement in India to save our businesses? There are certain examples that they have set in the past
Right,
few months. Yeah.
right. So South Korea and Singapore have demonstrated how technology and connectedness can be positively used to combat the crisis, the pandemic. So
Yes.
there, so the benefits to businesses in those countries have accrued through the channel of the mitigation of the health crisis. So it's really
Yes.
important to understand how they have managed the pandemic to then appreciate what it means for businesses. Let me use the example of South Korea, about which I know a couple of things. Uh, it's a good example of policy success in the case of COVID-19. So South Korea has very high penetration of digital technology, mostly afforded by the almost universal access to and ownership of smartphone technology.
Yes.
What that means is that there's an unprecedented, it's a universal level of interconnectedness that could
Yes.
be used.
Okay.
It's
Yes.
easier to get information to them. to receive information from them, right? And getting information to individuals is important because it shapes precautionary measures, and you can pass information quickly and efficiently in a personal manner.
Yes.
And receiving information is important because then you can use that information to manage the pandemic. So there are some case studies that tell us about the use of smartphone technology leveraged for contact tracing to identify those who are infected.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, to then trace, because there's a digital footprint, to trace those they have been in contact with.
Yes.
And manage the pandemic.
Yes.
I think this experience is very similar in Singapore, where, again, digital technologies of a different nature was used to contact trace, and that information was digital footprint of credit card transactions or digital payments. Let's just characterize them that way.
Yes.
Digital payments, including ATM transactions, credit cards, online payments, so that one can then paint a picture going back a couple of weeks of how an individual has been associated with other individuals, identifying vulnerabilities of the population, so tracing them, isolating them, and managing the solution. So the benefits to businesses in those economies have been afforded by efficient management of the problem. Let me also add that in both the economies, Singapore and South Africa, testing, efficient, easily accessible testing is a common feature.
Yes.
And I think these are lessons to be learned for several other economies, that if we are to overcome the challenges of the pandemic, these are some lessons that we could leverage. So ICT technologies, leveraging them to the extent that we can, recognizing the limitations of them, because all economies do not have near universal smartphone penetration. And second, the experience around testing.
Testing, yes, as fast as we can do. Yes. Last question from my side, like what are the major changes do you think need to be adopted by businesses to protect themselves, or at least cushion the shock presented by an event like this in future? What's the absolute need of the hour, like we can do that?
Right. From a business perspective, right? Well, there's so many things that businesses can do, right? So beyond the period of managing the pandemic, I think businesses need to very quickly respond to the changing nature of work.
Yes.
So we know that one of the challenges that has affected businesses is rapid decline in worker availability and worker productivity. And the source of that problem is that although the work that could have been shifted from a collective office or factory environment to the home environment or personal environment has happened to some extent. But I think more needs to be done in terms of ensuring worker productivity in these setups.
Yes.
I'm sure there's a great role for training, both for managers and workers, on how to improve the workflow. I think there are certain innovations that are pending. So there's a role of learning how to operate in this new personal environment, both by ways of training and compartmentalization of work, so that it lends itself to a distributed manner compared to when things used to be together. So we still have to work with people, that is, work in teams, but we need to work in a slightly isolated manner, which I think requires some level of innovation on how workflow and work stream is managed. I think there's another lesson for businesses, and that is around risk. So the crisis has showed us, and especially businesses, the folly of thin cash reserves. So a lot of businesses have operated on high corporate debt, low margins, and it's not easy to maintain cash reserves beyond a few months in those environments when you're competing in a marketplace with those practices. I think the vulnerability has now revealed that a higher degree of reserves in terms of cash um, are required to cushion any further shocks,
Shock.
which may be pandemic or of another nature. A third area which we earlier touched upon is clearly risk emanating from supply chain reliability. I think a lot of businesses will be trending towards more diversification as a matter of principle, and
Yes.
also gaining more sight about their first year suppliers versus second tier suppliers and third tier suppliers. Um, it would be naive of us to understand that businesses had a very tight grip on their supply chains. Surely they
Yes.
knew their first tier suppliers, but very few of them have adequately mapped the second tier and third tier suppliers, which may be potential sources of risk in the case of a global crisis such as this one. So these are some areas that I think businesses could improve in terms
Yes.
of enhancing their resilience. I think that's what I had to say about this. You had a second part of the question. What would that be?
What do you think about the absolute need of the hour? Like right now, what are the steps that businesses can take?
So we are focused on businesses and the private sector, but I still think I would like to come back to in terms of absolute need. The absolute need of the hour, I think, is a focus on people and a profound role for compassion,
Yes.
both in the business sector and policy responses to deal with businesses and people.
Yes.
So let me present my view that the focus has to be on managing the health effects of the pandemic. The
Yes.
economic effects are important, and I know there's a momentum to quickly open up the economy. But I must caution that any efforts that require or that support a very quick reversal to the normal may never be able to reverse back to the normal. That is, the policy
Yes.
will have limited effect.
Limited.
The issue of demand needs to be resolved for the economy to come back to a near normal. Demand can only be restored by restoring consumer confidence, investor confidence,
Yes.
which will happen in an environment when the health effects of the pandemic have been controlled and
And
mitigated away. I don't
yes.
think the focus should be anything else. It has to be on health.
It has to be. Yes.
But there is a role of policy, right? There's a role of policy, and we cannot undermine or discount the role of the economy.
Yes.
So I think for policymakers in India and elsewhere, and let me speak generally about the developing world, is
Yes.
to use this time judiciously for reforms, systematic
Yes.
reforms which address the traditional challenges that businesses were facing related to operational matters, matters of credit, right? Insolvency procedures, there's so many. So it's
Yes.
time to improve on the traditional barriers that have um, uh, been imposed on businesses, but also recognizing that the same issues are now much more magnified, and hence reforms are even more
Yes.
needed on an immediate basis. So I think this is an opportunity. This is a window of opportunity afforded to policymakers.
Yes.
Of course, the
Yes.
focus was on the pandemic, and attention is towards that side. But I think policy attention also needs to plan for recovery in the near term. So I think that's my typology of focus. First, health, based on
Mm.
compassion, and second, the
Yes.
economy, again based on
Okay.
compassion.
Yes, yes, because indeed it's a very difficult time for the policymakers, like to focus on lives or the economy, and we have to manage the balance in both the world.
Right, and this is the so it is a type of trade-off. It is a type of challenge. This
Yes,
also reveals for your audience the
yes,
challenges of policy making. There are
yes,
several trade-offs. In fact, every action in policy is a matrix of trade-offs.
yes,
Um,
yes,
But despite that, there are certain principles that one must ascribe to, and which is why I was emphasizing the principle of compassion in managing the health issue, because that is the root cause of the problem. The root cause has to be addressed, and I think that's a lesson that I would like to share with your audience.
Yes, indeed. Because so, thank you so much, sir, for coming to our show, and it was a very enriching session. At last, I would like to ask a few words of encouragement to ecoholics.
So, Sanat, thank you very much. So let me reciprocate the thanks, magnified reciprocal of your thanks. It was great talking to you. I think you have very topical, timely questions that resonate both in India and elsewhere. I surely benefited from thinking about these questions. I think for your audience, I think the one thing I can say is that the pandemic is also a learning opportunity. It's a good time to be a student.
Yes.
Remember all the things I said about human capital.
Yes.
Human capital is not defined by what we already know. Human capital is also defined by what we need to know for a new era. I think we are entering a new era in modern history. And I would encourage the students to think about issues of risk, issues of how to organize businesses, how to organize workers, the trade-offs one must consider when thinking about this relationship. I would also encourage them to think deeply about the effects of these pandemics on a wide variety of individuals in society. Society has so many groups, so many aspirations, so many communities who have different ways of life. So the role of compassion, I think, has been quite prominent in the way I think about it, and I would encourage young students to also think about vulnerabilities of the poor and how compassion can play a role in policy making.
Yes.
The last thing I would like to say for students is that this is a new era. It requires new solutions. The rule books, the playbooks that we had of the past, that we used in the past, have been neutralized. The new challenge has completely neutralized how we knew how to manage the economy and make policy, to be honest. And I think there's a need for a new playbook. I would encourage, and I think I would in some way gently challenge the students and youngsters who are associated with your organization to take up on this challenge of innovation in policy, innovation in businesses, innovation in how people engage with the economy. And I think that's my thought on this.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful session with you, and thank you for accepting our offer to be on the part of Thinking Tree series. And it was a very enriching session, very knowledgeable. And the main motive why I have started this Thinking Tree is to provide solutions. So in this a small video of like around 45 minutes, it got a lot of solutions for the government and the policymakers. So thank you so much, sir, for appearing in the show.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Have a good night.
Yeah.